Welcome everyone, it's a pleasure to be back, and it's a pleasure to present you with episode 1 of the 3rd season of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library. This episode is sponsored by George and Susie Fishman. It's in memory of Susie's mother, Magda Weiss, Shendel Bas Moshe Aleha Sholom, and her memory should be a blessing. Her yahrzeit was on the 10th of Shvat. It's quite some time ago, but we hadn't put an episode together yet at that stage, but we're delighted to be able to commemorate her memory. Her neshama should have an aliyah. We should be zeicher to see Tchias HaMesim. It's an interesting episode today, and as you can see, my desk is full of material. I'm going to begin at the end, as I always do, because I want to give you a taste of where we're heading. As you know, I am someone who acquires, on quite a regular basis, items of Judaica and Hebraica. I'm very interested in anything that has to do with Jewish history from a practical perspective. I'm not just interested in reading history books. I believe that you gain knowledge from touching and feeling and experiencing history. And the only way to do that is with artifacts and with books and with manuscripts. It's the only way to do it. So, of course, I'm constantly acquiring. Now, many, many years ago, I was going through material at a book dealer, and he was showing me a file of manuscript material, and he showed me this. And it's a very interesting, it's a postcard, it's a very interesting manuscript. As you can see, it is written in Hebrew, but it's written in what we refer to, incorrectly by the way, as Rashi script. Of course, Rashi never wrote this way. The reason why it's referred to as Rashi script is because in the original printed Gemaras, this was the Hebrew font that they used, the style of Hebrew lettering that was used to print Rashi and Tosfos on the side of the page. The square print that we're familiar with was the one that was used for the Gemara and the Mishnah, but this was what was used for Rashi. I think we've discussed it in the past, but in any event, this script actually, this style of writing is a Sephardic style of writing. And I was fascinated by it, not because it was Sephardic, because I come across Sephardic manuscripts on a regular basis, but because the person who wrote it actually was writing it from Satmar, not well known as a center of Sephardic activity. There was, as far as I know, there wasn't a Sephardic shul. Edot Mizrach didn't have a strong foothold in Satmar, but nonetheless, this was written in a Sephardic script, which I found fascinating. And the person who signed it was somebody who was vaguely known to me. At that stage, I didn't know much about him. Hatzor Shlomo Yehuda, he spells Yehuda with an Aleph, Sfardi Tahor, that's Samach Tes, HaSephardi Mechuna Friedlander, Pei Lamed. So this man is a character. You're going to hear a lot about him today. I don't have a photo of him, I only have examples of his handwriting, and his handwriting, as you can tell, is the Sephardic handwriting. I found that very curious. I wanted to know a little bit more. I bought this. I don't think I spent a lot of money on it. I put it aside and it lay gathering dust. I must have bought it 20 or 25 years ago. Didn't think much of it, and there it lay. We're going to now fast forward. I'm going to be jumping backwards and forwards today, and Carly is very keenly and eagerly telling me that I've got to keep this episode into a 60-minute segment. And she believes that I've got at least 2 or 3 hours worth of material here. She may very well be right. But I'm going to begin with an article I wrote 3 or 4 years ago. It's an article that I wrote but haven't finished. And it's, as you're going to see, it's based on a fascinating story, a vignette that is recorded in a publication that I'm going to share with you after I've read you the introduction to the article, and this article has never been published. The Curious Tale of the Jerusalem Talmud Forgery. This is in Khust, Hungary in 1907. A strange visitor. The man standing at the front of the synagogue study hall in the Chust Yeshiva looked completely out of place. He was wrapped head to toe in a flamboyant, oversized, embroidered silk tallis, a prayer shawl, and two tiny haired phylacteries adorned his forehead. He swayed slowly from side to side, his lips mouthing a silent prayer as his eyes rolled back so that only the whites were visible. He was exotic, unlike anyone the yeshiva boys had ever seen before. His bushy black beard curled out of his face in every direction, and his head was completely enveloped in a multicolored yarmulke. From time to time he would wave his hands in the air as if gesticulating towards God to emphasize an unheard prayer. The teenage yeshiva boys gathered in groups and stared at him, whispering to each other excitedly. Although their yeshiva regularly hosted guest rabbis and dignitaries from all over the world, no visitor had ever aroused such curiosity and interest. Among the yeshiva boys was a young man called Shlomo Yehuda Greenwald, 18 years old, from the nearby city of Siget. Having entered the synagogue a little later than the others, he had no idea who the unusual visitor was, although he was intrigued by his appearance. "Who is he?" he inquired. "Don't you know?" one of his friends replied. "He is a Sephardic rabbi, a great scholar. Apparently, he recently discovered manuscripts of the lost Jerusalem Talmud on Kodshim. Everyone is talking about him. He is here to ask the Rosh Yeshiva for a letter of support, but he doesn't speak any Yiddish, only Hebrew, and he pronounces it with a Sephardic accent. It's really weird." Suddenly, Greenwald was not just intrigued, he was fascinated. Not by the strange-looking guest's arresting appearance, nor by the fact that he spoke Hebrew with a Sephardic accent. He was fascinated by the claim that this man had discovered the text of the Talmudic composition on Kodshim. Greenwald had a particular interest in Jewish bibliographic history and was familiar with the fact that there were only scattered references to the Jerusalem Talmud on Kodshim in the writings of early medieval rabbis, but that no published text of these tractates existed. It was widely assumed that the texts had always been scarce, even in ancient times, and were then lost before the advent of the printing press, never to be recovered. The fact that a manuscript had now emerged was remarkable enough, but to actually be able to meet the man who had discovered the manuscript was absolutely exhilarating for Greenwald. "What's his name? Where did he find the manuscript? Does he have it with him?" The question spilled out of Greenwald's mouth. His friends went silent. "His last name is Al-Ghazi," one of them answered, although he also calls himself Friedlander. "I chatted with him for a few minutes when he arrived. It was quite hard to understand him. He told me that his brother discovered the manuscript in Izmir. If I understood him correctly, it was buried among a collection of documents that belonged to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Venisti." "You mean the Rabbi Yehoshua ben Venisti, author of the Stei Yehoshua commentary on the Jerusalem Talmud, brother of Reb Chaim ben Venisti, chief rabbi of Izmir, during the Chacham Tzvi episode? Shabtai Tzvi episode, excuse me." Greenwald's friend nodded. "Yes, him. Rabbi Al-Ghazi told me that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Venisti purchased the manuscript more than 200 years ago from someone called Avraham Alevi, a converso Jew from Portugal, who returned to the Jewish religion in Turkey. Halevi told Rabbi Yehoshua ben Venisti he had obtained the manuscript from a Catholic priest in Barcelona and was eager to make sure it ended up in the right hands. Greenwald walked to the front of the synagogue to greet the visitor personally. This was the most momentous occasion of his life. So that's as far as I got in my article. And now I want to tell you a little bit more information. I'd like to introduce to you a man who we've already mentioned in this article as an 18-year-old yeshiva bocher, and that's Rabbi Yehuda, also known as Leopold. By the way, Yehuda, for some strange reason among Hungarian Jews, is also a pseudonym, or it's an alternative name for Zalman Leib. Don't ask me why. I've asked many Hungarian Jews to explain to me why Yehuda is also Zalman Leib. They've not been able to explain it to me. But whatever the case may be, Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald was an extraordinary man. I have here a little bit of information about him. I've been in touch with his family, and what I want to tell you about him is this. He was born in the 19th century. Obviously, he was born, I think, in 1889. He died in 1955, and we have here a picture of him hard at work in his study in Columbus, Ohio, where eventually he became the rabbi. He spent the last 30 years of his life as the rabbi of the Beth Jacob congregation, Orthodox shul in Columbus, Ohio. He was a splendid Talmud Chacham. When I say that, I mean there was no area of Torah that he wasn't familiar with. He studied in the Chust yeshiva, as we're going to hear. He also studied in the yeshiva of Satmar, before the Satmar Rebbe became the Rav of Satmar. He studied under somebody called Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald, no relation as far as I know, and we're going to hear about other Greenwalds as well, by the way, which is interesting. But Greenwald was quite a familiar or common name in the Hungarian community. He studied in the yeshiva first in Chust, as I said, and then he studied in Satmar. Later on, he went to Rabbi Nehemiah Nobel's yeshiva in Frankfurt. Now, Rabbi Nehemiah Nobel was also an interesting man. He was the Irov in Cologne and later in Königsberg, which for the Dunner family is interesting because my family comes from Cologne, and my grandfather became later on the Rav in Königsberg, which was in East Prussia. Cologne is in West Germany. And Rabbi Nehemiah Nobel was a fascinating individual. He was a Rosh Yeshiva in Frankfurt, and Rabbi Greenwald studied there. Later on, he moved to the United States, spent a little bit of time in New York, later on went to Columbus, where he remained for the next 30 years of his life. Now, it's interesting. Here's a picture, by the way, of his family. This is him and his wife, and he's got 3 children. His youngest son, now you see, I just told you he died in 1955. His youngest son was born in 1928. His name was Jack. And Jack Greenwald just died literally a few weeks ago in March of 2021. Here's a picture of Jack. Jack Greenwald lived in Denver, but he wasn't just a Jew in Denver. He was one of the most important members of the Jewish community of Denver. I've got here it's called the Intermountain Jewish News, and they published an obituary for Jack in which they said as follows. I'm going to read you some information about the son of Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald, who's important for our story. The sparkle in his eye, the deadpan which his inner smile sailed through as he was reciting the long-forgotten phone number of the person he was summoning so that he or she not be forgotten. The setting, announcements in the shul, which Jack Greenwald made as president because he was the president of more organizations than anyone else in Denver Jewish history. Jack Greenwald, it would seem, was somebody who was at the forefront of Jewish life, but he didn't get it from nowhere. His father was at the forefront of Jewish life, and his father, this incredible rabbi, who we've seen. Here's, I think I have another photo of Jack somewhere. Oh, here we have Rabbi Greenwald's obituary as it was published when he died in Columbus in the Ohio Jewish Chronicle in 1955. It says here, hundreds who attended funeral services last Tuesday morning for Rabbi Leopold Z. Greenwald represented thousands who mourned the passing of Beth Jacob congregation's beloved spiritual leader. The 67-year-old Jewish scholar, author, and dean of Columbus rabbis died at his home. 967 Gears Avenue last Monday morning. He had been in failing health, but didn't become seriously ill until a few hours before his death, which was due to a blood clot of the lungs. Incredible that they gave all this information in the short announcement of his death in that Jewish Chronicle article. But Rabbi Greenwald is not remembered because he was an exceptional public speaker. He wasn't a great darshan. He's not remembered because somehow he was able to capture the hearts and minds of his congregation through his great pastoral involvement in their lives. That wasn't his forte. What he is remembered for is as the author of countless, numerous scholarly works, but written in such a way, there's this word that I've spoken about before, publicist. He was an incredible publicist of Orthodox Judaism and of Orthodox Jewish history. In my book in the piece that I wrote about Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Yonas Ebershitz in Mavericks, Mystics and False Messiahs, in the end I wrote a postscript to the book, an afterword, in which I mentioned the fact that one of the principal books that I have on Rabbi Yonas Ebershitz was written by none other than Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald. He wrote something called Beis Yonason. It's an incredible work, and he also authored numerous other works, best remembered for his book Kolboy. It's 3 volumes on the halachas and the customs, the minhagim, relating to Jewish mourning. Why am I talking about Rabbi Greenwald? Well, obviously, as you've heard, we had that story at the beginning of my article, which is not yet published, about the man who published the forged Yerushalmi. We're going to get to him, but I want to talk about the article that was written on which I based my article. There is a publication, I'm not sure if it still comes out, I don't get it, called HaPardes. HaPardes was a publication that began in 1913 in Poland, and the person who began it was somebody called Reb Shmuel Aaron Halevi Pardes. Here's a picture of him. Later on, in 1924, he moved to the United States and briefly had to suspend the publication of HaPardes until he eventually became a rabbi in Chicago, of the Bikur Cholim Shul in Chicago. And in 1927, he restarted the publication of HaPardes, and it became the default publication of the Agudas HaRabbonim of America. The Agudas HaRabbonim started in 1902. They'd never had their own regular publication, which brought together the scholarly articles of the rabbis who made up the Agudas HaRabbonim. But Rab Shmuel Aaron Pardes, brought all these rabbis together, and he published it. He died in 1956. And in 1951, they published a volume of articles in his honor. They said the 25th anniversary. It's not quite right, but they said the 25th anniversary, the Sefer HaYovel of HaPardes. The reason why they called it the Sefer HaYovel was not because it was a precise number, but because at that stage, the person who became the editor, the managing editor, and the person who published HaPardes was a man called Rabbi Simcha Elberg, himself a fascinating character. Rabbi Simcha Elberg, he died in 1995 at the age of 80, never had any children, but he published HaPardes until the end of his life. And the HaPardes periodical, the journal, was the main rabbinic journal of the United States. I think I've spoken about it before in some of my lectures, because it does come up, because various disputes that took place within the rabbinic fraternity were often reflected on the pages of HaPardes. And Rav Simcha Elberg was the person who took HaPardes in 1950-51 and brought it forward for the next few decades. He was a very important figure in the Orthodox Jewish life of the United States of America. But in 1951, they published this very significant book. Here's the book. It's the journal. The journal HaPardes publishes this jubilee book in honor of Reb Shmuel Aaron Pardes And in this book are countless articles. Now, I don't know how readily available this book is. I'm not sure that it's easy to find. Perhaps you can find it on HebrewBooks.org. I haven't looked, but a hard copy would be hard to find. But one of the articles that's in this book is an article by none other than Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald. And we're going to be reading that article. I'm going to be looking through that article. Here's the article. You can see it there, and it's framed there here. You can see that's the first page of the article. And the article is titled Yerushalmi al Kodshim, the Jerusalem Talmud on the Tractate of Kodshim, Perek Mizichronoisai. It's a chapter in my memoirs, says Rabbi Greenwald. He says, this is a story from my memoirs, and I want to recall it. I want to tell you the story. And the story is absolutely fascinating because Rabbi Greenwald, he may have been a rabbi in Ohio, in Columbus, for 30 years or more, and he may have been deeply acculturated into the life of the Jews of the United States. But he came from Hungary, and he studied in Yeshiva in Chust, and he came from Siget. He was born in Siget, and later on he was a bocher in the Yeshiva in Satmar, and he was at the heart of this story in the very first decade of the 20th century. I'm going to share this with you, and we're going to dedicate this particular section to the memory of Jack Greenwald, who died just a few weeks ago. And in Mitzvah Hashem, we should be zoicha to see Tchias HaMesim. We should be able to see him being the president of many Jewish organizations again in our lifetime. Bein hamichtovim harabbim migdoyle u'michachmei Yisrael hashmurim etzli, he says. This is what he opens with. He says, in between, among the many letters from great rabbis and from great Jewish scholars that I have kept, safely over the years, that I have filed away. Nimtza nartik yoshen. I have an old file. Boi michtovim, within it there are letters. Alim noishnim u'tu'udoi shoinos, of a varying different type. But al hanartik nirsham shnas tofresh samach zayin tofresh ein gimel Friedlander. The title of this file is the years 1907 to 1913 Friedlander. Zoisoi meres. Why is that the case? It just gives you an indicator. If I'm talking about it now and it's lying there gathering dust, I haven't opened it for over 30 years. I don't know when he wrote this article. It was published in 1951. But he says here he hasn't opened this file for several decades. It's not a pleasant episode in my life. And it wasn't in my particular interest. I didn't feel that I ever wanted to recall this particular moment in my life. In other words, Rabbi Greenwald is saying is, I filed it away and I kept it there in the file, and that's where I wanted it to stay. It wasn't something that I'd ever wanted to think about again. By the way, we've all got files like that. We've got things that we file away. We don't want to throw them away. We don't want to chuck them out. We don't want to trash them. But on the other hand, we don't necessarily want to delve into them in any great detail ever again. They're just there. Somehow, we know that they're there. They know that they're there. And there they must stay, hidden. But in this particular case, things changed, as you're going to hear. Friedlander shehirish bismanes beis Yisrael kva ozav es Eretz HaChaim. He says, in the first instance, let's be honest. Rabbi Friedlander, he's already died. It's not appropriate, perhaps, to talk about somebody who has already died. Perhaps it would be better to let, as we say in English, sleeping dogs lie. Why think about this again? Why should we bother ourselves with this particular story? We know that Romeo Domplotsky, we're going to get to him, hopefully we'll get to him. But Romeo Domplotsky already addressed this issue at some point. Why do we need to address it? What point would there be? He's already dealt with it and it's done. He was at the head of all those rabbis who fought against and who opposed the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud that was published on the tractate Kodshim, v'neged mechabrei, and against its author, against its publisher. Umerame zois besifrei she'alu shalom Yerushalayim. He hints that in his book titled She'alu Shalom Yerushalayim, and we're going to see that book a little bit later on. I have a copy of that book. And this is what Romeo Domplotsky said. By the way, Romeo Domplotsky was a fascinating individual. Here we have a picture of him. He was a Rav, he was a Gerach Chosid, and he opened a yeshiva, and it was one of the biggest yeshivas in Poland. He was a phenomenal Talmud Chacham. He's best remembered for his parish on the Chumash, Kli Chemda. Have you got the Kli Chemda? If you don't have it, you should get it. The Kli Chemda on the Chumash. He died in 1928, but for about a year, 15 years before he died, he traveled around the Jewish world. He went to Europe, he went to America, and this is a picture of him where he was meeting with President Taft, and he was together with Rabbi Osher Spitzer, he was together with Rabbi Dr. Meir Hildesheimer, and with Dr. Natan Birbaum. He's the man here with a beard, the long white beard. He was the founder of the Aguda, of Agudas Yisrael. He was the German founder of Agudas Yisrael. He was originally not a religious man, but he became religious. He came up with the word for the Zionist movement. The word Zionism was a word that was put together or thought up by Dr. Natan Birnbaum, later became an Orthodox Jew. He rejected secular Zionism and was one of the founders and spokesmen for Agudas Yisrael. They traveled around the world together and they met with the American president, and this is a photograph, not with the president, President Taft, but it was taken before that incredible meeting, and this is a picture that we have of Romeo Domplotsky. We're going to get back to him. So it says here that Romeo Domplotsky wrote about this particular episode as follows. He says, he says, the truth is, She'alu Shalom Yerushalayim it's not such a big sefer. I have it over here somewhere. It isn't such a big sefer. Here it is. It's quite a small sefer. It's more of a pamphlet than a sefer. And it was written to oppose as we're going to see, and we're going to get back to it, was written to oppose the Yerushalmi on Kodshim. But it's a small sefer, and he says there's a reason for it. He says, I've got a lot of material, but I want to include all the material in the sefer. Omnom, maybe I can find place in a newspaper. Maybe I will include in the newspaper articles about this episode the letters that I have from Rabbi Klein. Now, Rabbi Klein was also an interesting man. You know, there were status quo communities in Hungary. By the way, Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald wrote a lot about this subject. Here I have a picture of Rabbi Klein. I have the original. It comes from the Eisenstadt collection. Here it is. I think that Carly, when we put this on YouTube, is going to put a bigger version of this picture so you can see it in its full glory, as this is not a published picture. Rita Klein was also a publisher. He published a Jewish journal, a rabbinic journal, on a regular basis, and he was one of the great Talmidei Chachomim of Satmar. And we always we have this illusion that the Satmar Jewish community before the Second World War at any point was more Hasidic than Ashkenaz. In fact, it was much more Ashkenaz than Hasidic, and he was the rabbi, or was the principal rabbi of the Satmar community, not the accepted rabbi for the Haredi community, but for the formal rabbi of the community as far as the government was concerned. And he was also the publisher of this very important rabbinic journal. So he corresponded with Romeo Domplotsky, and in that correspondence were a lot of details about Rabbi Friedlander. But it wasn't only him. You're going to see that he also corresponded with Maharash Friedlander. So he says, Romeo Domplotsky, I have a lot of letters. By the way, Rabbi Friedlander, Dr. Solomon or Shlomo Friedlander, who was the person who came up with the Yerushalmi, was a prolific writer, prolific correspondent. V'oid ish ach echad chaver chiber. And he says there's another man. And here Rabbi Greenwald reveals that man is none other than him. He is the one that Romeo Domplotsky is referring to. He's had this extensive correspondence with three people about the Yerushalmi on Kodshim affair, and that those people are Rabbi Klein, Friedlander himself, and Rabbi Greenwald, who's now writing this. And he says as follows: Aval lada'avoini lo hispik lo hashav efsha sheshav machshavtoi. It seems that Rabbi Meir Domplotsky never got to publish that article in the newspapers, which contained all the correspondence regarding this affair. Misiba loinoi dasli, and the truth is I don't know why, because he did live for many more years after the affair took place. After all, he published his book Shlomo Yerushalmi in 1910. He died in 1928. He had another 18 years to publish those letters, but he never got round to it, and I don't know why. Aval kasher bikarani yedidenu hagon Reb Shmuel Aaron Pardes Shlita. You know, I had a visit. Rabbi Pardes came to visit me. By the way, I have a particular fondness for Rabbi Pardes. He had a brother in London, and his brother, also a Polish rabbi, lived in London. I don't think he was the rabbi of a community, but he seems to have been quite influential. And he died, and they decided to open a school in his memory. The school is called HaPardes House, and I went to that school as a child. So this Reb Shmuel Aaron Pardes had a brother in England, in whose name they dedicated a school, and that's where I received my initial Jewish education. In any event, he says Reb Shmuel Aaron Pardes came to visit him. He says it happened to be a conversation, went from one place to another, and we ended up talking about this forged Yerushalmi and its author. I showed him the many letters that I have in this file, this hidden file, which was hidden for 30 years. And we went over this entire backwards and forwards, the toing and froing regarding this particular affair, this incident in previous years, which took place over the forged Yerushalmi on Kodshim. Torah Sheba'al Peh says the fact is, says Torah Sheba'al Peh, nobody knows about it. He says, I'm the only one that remains. Rabbi Klein is dead. Rabbi Meir Domplotsky is dead. Rabbi Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander is dead. All of the people who are involved, directly or indirectly, with this story of the forged Yerushalmi are no longer alive. He's writing in 1950 or 51. He says, that's it. If I don't talk about it, the story is gone. He says, I am the only person left alive who can say with great clarity and with knowledge, with real information, that the person who we're talking about, this Friedlander, is a forger who fraudulently put together the Yerushalmi on Kodshim. In which case, it is of great importance. This is what Rabbi Pardes said to him, and he obviously came to this realization himself. It is exceptionally important for me to publish this material and to get this story out. That's the first reason. The second reason is historia loy terachim. History, and this, by the way, really talks to me. History has no mercy. Historian lo yochais v'lo yechoinen, and a historian has no permission, has no latitude when it comes to this. They cannot be sympathetic, they can't be biased, they must be objective, and they must publish the truth. That is important. Alav lichtov ha'emes. That is incumbent upon every historian. So this article in HaPardes came about as a result of Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald, Rabbi Leopold Greenwald, of Columbus, Ohio, realizing that he was the last man standing. He was the one who had to reveal the information on the forged Yerushalmi on Kodshim. And I don't know if I have the photo here, I had it before, But he talks about the fact, I'm not going to read through the whole article, that this man arrived in the yeshiva. You heard what I said before, the beginning of my article, arrived in yeshiva, and he came a little bit late. He asks his friend, who is this guy? The guy is the guy who found the Yerushalmi, and there's a whole story. It originates in the Benvenisti family, and it came through this way and that way and other, and he's here to receive the authority and the endorsation of the Arugas Haboisem, the Rosh Yeshiva of the Chust Yeshiva, where Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald was a Bocher who was studying Torah. And after davening, all the Bocherim gathered round this intriguing-looking individual who spoke only in a Sephardic Hebrew, and he went across to the Rosh Yeshiva and to the Rav of Chust, whose name was Reb Moshe ben Reb Amram Greenwald. Again, no relation of this. He was no relation of Rabbi Greenwald from Columbus, Ohio. Although, interestingly enough, he had a son called Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald. Why am I mentioning that? Because the Chust Greenwald family are the family from whom originates the Pupa Hasidic dynasty that is active in New York. Reb Shila Greenwald, who came afterwards, after the Holocaust, he survived the Holocaust, he was the Rav of Chust, and he came as well. He was a Rav in Borough Park, and he had, I think, a brother or a nephew who came also, who survived the Holocaust, and he founded the Pupa Hasidic dynasty, and there are many Pupa Hasidim in Williamsburg and elsewhere. They are descendants of the Arugas Haboisem, who was one of the most extraordinary rabbinic leaders and educators in Hungary in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century. He died in 1910. Fascinating that Friedlander came with his manuscripts and letters of support to the Arugas Haboisem, and the Arugas Haboisem, it says, Achre atfila, his yatsev ha'orach lifnei Rabbeinu im kuntreisim ha'Yerushalmi chtovim migdali Yisrael b'yodai v'onu achrov. We were all there surrounding him as he showed his paperwork, as it were, to prove that he was correct and that this was a legitimate project to the Arugas Haboisem. We all stood around him, and guess what happened? V'shomanu es devarav shediber beloshem medaberes gedolos. He spoke big. He was an exceptionally charismatic figure. Clearly a man with great confidence. He was a conman, after all, as we're going to see. He was an utter conman, but he managed to portray himself as this Sephardic Jew who had discovered this manuscript in Turkey via his brother, and that his brother had brought it to him, and he had produced this incredible material. This material that demonstrated that the Yerushalmi on Kodshim wasn't lost, but here we have it again. And he says to Rabbi Greenwald, the Rosh Yeshiva of Chust, the Arugas Haboisem, he says to him, perhaps you'll offer your endorsement as well. Perhaps you'll write a letter of support for this great project. Rabbeinu lokach es hagilyonos. The rabbi, the Rosh Yeshiva, took the papers, v'hibit bahem kasho'a shalema, and he looked through them for a full hour. He examined them very, very closely. V'onu nitzavnu kamoinod ba'oznayim kashuvay shamanu tshuvas rabbeinu. We were waiting eagerly. We were very excited to see, what is the rabbi going to say? How will the Arugas Haboisem respond to this Friedlander's attempts to engage him and to get him to give an endorsing letter for this project? And achrei hichzir liyodos hakuntreisim, afterwards he gave back the kuntreisim to Friedlander, and he said as follows: Chaval, he said, what a pity. Haksav yad hazeh einoi ha'Yerushalmi al Kodshim. He says, I'm sorry to tell you that based on my examination over the last hour, I cannot possibly offer you my endorsement. These are not manuscripts that represent a true Kodshim of Yerushalmi. They absolutely are incorrect, they are fraudulent, they are fake. That's what he said to him. Nivhalnu lishmaya advarim ha'eleh. Says Rabbi Greenwald of Ohio. He says, we were shocked to hear the Rogas HaBoisim say this. After all, he was able to prove himself with all these letters of support, etc. And he had the Maharsham support. The Maharsham was one of the great rabbis at that time. He was the Rav of Berzhani. His name was Sholem Modcha of Berzan. Shvadron was his last name. He had a grandson of the same name, Reb Sholem Shvadron, who was the Maggid of Yerushalmi. He died about 20 or 25 years ago. He was the Rav of Berzhani, and he wrote the Shalos Tshuvas Maharsham, and he was a great supporter of Friedlander in this Yerushalmi on Kodshim. So how is it possible that the Arugas HaBoisim didn't offer his support? Because we see that the Berzana Rav gave his support to this endeavor. Our rabbi refused to agree that this was a legitimate Yerushalmi on Kodshim. And this Sfardi, this Friedlander, this Algazi left the Beis Medrash of the yeshiva after this entire performance that had taken a couple of hours. First he had davened in this very colourful way, and then he had presented his credentials to the rabbi and the paperwork. The rabbi had considered it and had rejected it, and now he went off to his hotel. But Greenwald of Ohio was very taken by him and went to his hotel, and they went on long walks together. He became very friendly with him. I want to read you one more piece from this article, and then we're going to move on to the next bits and pieces that we have here of this story. He says that he moved on to another yeshiva in Chodesh Elul of Tafreish Samach Zayin of 1907. He went to another yeshiva, went to the yeshiva in Satmar. He said, in between, I was in my parents' home in Siget. Rabbi Friedlander ro einai, and he was in Siget, Rabbi Friedlander, and we crossed paths, and he saw me. Samachti imoi, I was so happy to see me. He was very happy to see me. He said to me, you know what, young man? It would be so wonderful if you could organize for me to speak in some of the shuls here in the neighborhood, in this city. V'lim karsi Yerushalmi, and I want to sell the Yerushalmi. By now it was published. By now it had been published, and it was available for people to buy. He said, I want to be able to sell copies of the Yerushalmi, and perhaps you can arrange for me to give droshas and shiurim in various shuls so that I will be able to sell the Yerushalmi. V'kasha sha'altiv, mi yovin devarov, Be'eri, Acharesha Medaber Rak Ivris, Vedavka, Bemivta Sfardi, says, I said to him, I can't quite understand what you mean. How is it possible that you think you're going to speak in the shuls here in Siget? Because you don't speak Yiddish, you only speak Ivrit, you speak Hebrew with a Havara Sfardit, and nobody understands the Sephardic pronunciation. You're going to go to shul, you're going to speak, no one's going to know what you're talking about. So what would be the point of me arranging for you to speak? So this fellow says to him, Alzeh ononi ki bavoyi me'asya. He says, you know what, the truth is, when I originate in Asia, but when I came from Asia, I lived, I lived in Germany, and I learned to speak German. He says, I speak fluent German, and therefore, even though, of course, my Hebrew pronunciation isn't very good, and I don't speak Yiddish, but I am able to speak German, and perhaps if I speak German, the people here who speak Yiddish will understand me. Please arrange for me to speak in the various shuls. Well, all right, he's a young man. Don't forget, he was 18 years old. He wasn't an old and experienced individual, and he didn't understand that he was being played, he was being manipulated. So what did he do? Toiv. Onisib. I said to him, very good, no problem. I went with him to the presidents of the community, the heads of the community, the leaders, V'dar Hasham, and he spoke in all the shuls in Siget. The Imkil fellow, it was an absolute wonder. I couldn't get it in my head how incredible it was. How he learnt in Germany to speak Yiddish exactly like a Litvak. What an incredible power he had in languages, that he was able to speak such a perfect and fluent Yiddish, but just like a Litvak. No, he didn't sound like he was speaking German. Im kol zeh macharti loi keshishim tovsim. As a result of all this, we managed to sell 60 copies of the Yerushalmi, Karasnu Bris Ahava, and we were very friendly with each other. And I became one of his great supporters and his great advocates. I'm not going to read you the whole article. Perhaps it is available on HebrewBooks.org. It's a fascinating article. I'm going to now digress from the article. I just suffice to say that his love-hate relationship with his Friedlander continued for many, many more years, and he wasn't able ever to reconcile himself to the fact that the man was a complete fraud, until ultimately he realized that he was a complete fraud. But on occasions he was very friendly with him, on occasions they didn't get on very well at all. He wrote, it's interesting, that Rabbi Greenwald of Ohio, I think even before he got to America, wrote in Eisenstein's Oitzer, the encyclopedia that he has, he wrote the entry on Kodshim and on Yerushalmi, and he says recently the Yerushalmi on Kodshim has been published, but it's very controversial, and there's people who say that it's not correct. And he fell out with Friedlander because he'd suggested that there were people who didn't agree with him. So I want to now introduce you to the flyer that I bought some years ago. This flyer was, I had to rescue it. It was in very, very poor condition. And this flyer is the original promotional flyer for the Yerushalmi that was published by Friedlander at some point. Here it is. As you can see, I've protected it by putting it in boards. And you can see how it's damaged, that it's got a cut running right the way through it. And what's fascinating is, it's a poster, it's a flyer that's seeking sponsors and funds for the publication of this notorious forgery, the Kodshim of the Yerushalmi. And it's with his commentary, the Cheshek Shlomo. But what's so incredible about this flyer is that it includes the support on the flyer of some of the most significant rabbis of Hungary at that time. Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald, I've mentioned already, of Satmar, who for years after he had already been proved to be a forger, continued to offer his support. Rabbi Tzvi Shapira of Munkach, the father of the Munkacher Rebbe, who himself was the Munkacher Rebbe, he is included on this flyer here, and all these rabbis obviously subsequently withdrew their support. At some point they realized the man was a fraud, and but nevertheless he claimed that he'd found this manuscript in the year a manuscript that originated in the year 1212. So that means the manuscript was 700 years old, that his brother had found it in Turkey, that he had received it, and that he was able to prove that it was correct, and anybody who denied its validity or who suggested that it was a fraud was himself a fraud. So as I said, this is the poster, and here we have also Rabbi Aryeh Leib Horowitz of Stanislav. We have the Rav of Satmar, Rabbi Yehuda Greenwald, Rabbi Tzvi Shapira, and we have at the bottom here, we have Rabbi Yosef, who is the Rav in Kossen, the Kossener Rav. So this was an original piece that I bought. This was what went around the Jewish world, and everybody was extremely excited. They say that the Chofetz Chaim started wearing Rabbeinu Tam tefillin as a result of something that was included in the Yerushalmi on Kodshim that was published by Friedlander, which in and of itself is very, very interesting. But you know what? There were people who absolutely ripped it apart. As we saw already, there was Romeo Domplotsky, who published Shlomo Yerushalmi, which is a brilliant book in which he tears this Yerushalmi to pieces. He proves without any question whatsoever that this Yerushalmi on Kodshim was just a collection of material that had nothing whatsoever to do with an original manuscript, but which was brilliantly cobbled together by somebody who was a forger. Now, I'm going to read to you the article in the Encyclopedia Judaica. It's not something I often do, but I think it's important based on the fact that all the information I'm going to share with you today, and I've given you already far too much information, I'm never going to get through it all, comes from the person who wrote this article. Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander. It's on page 182 of the F volume of the Encyclopedia Judaica. Author and literary forger, Friedlander gave contradictory biographical accounts of his life, claiming at various times to have been born in Hungary, Turkey, Romania, but in all probability, and here's why he had a Litvish accent when he spoke in Yiddish, in all probability he was born in Belchenkovichi near Vitebsk in Belarusia. He studied at Volozhin, he wandered around Europe, he was in Chernovitz, he was in Mainz, he was in Frankfurt. In Frankfurt, by the way, he was a fishmonger. And he went to various places. He ended up in Satmar from 1906, and he died, in fact, in 1924. Here is a photograph of his kever. It can be found to this day in Satmar. I know that people have seen it and have sent photos. This is a photo of someone who took a photo in the cemetery in Satmar, and it says on it, it calls him Moreno Harav Shlomo Yehuda ben Moreno Harav Menachem Niftar Ches Shvat Tov Reish Pei Daled, 1924, and he calls him Friedlander. And he was an interesting character. He published a number of different works, mainly on Tosefta, and he would always publish his own parish. He was obviously brilliant, Cheshik Shlomo, but at some point he decided he was going to be a forger. And there maybe have been other forgeries that he forged, but this was the most important of all of them. He pretended that he'd found this Sefer Kodshim on Talmud Yerushalmi, claimed to have found this manuscript from 1212, and he published the first volume in 1907, the second volume in 1909, on Zevachim and Erchin, on Chulin and Bechoros, with his commentary Cheshik Shlomo. And he believed, he managed to convince quite a number of people that what he was doing was valid. For example, he managed to convince, I don't know where the picture is, he managed to convince Solomon Shakhtar. I don't see the picture, but perhaps when we put the video together, you can put the picture up of Solomon Shakhtar. Solomon Shakhtar is an interesting man, because Solomon Shakhtar is the one who went through the Geniza in Cairo, and he was the one who originally published various pieces from the Geniza in Cairo. He was somebody who understood manuscripts, and yet he was fooled by Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander into believing that this was real and that the Yerushalmi on Kodshim existed. Another one who he managed to fool was Solomon Buber, who actually wrote a long introduction to the Yerushalmi on Kodshim. If you look, there's various publications which came out in which, here we go, this is the Hebräische Bibliographie, it was a Zeitschrift. It was a very important journal that talked about all the Jewish publications that had come out. And in this one we have an article by somebody called Wilhelm Bacher. Wilhelm Bacher was originally born in Budapest. He wrote in German. He was considered to be a distinguished scholar of Judaica and Jewish history. And he wrote an article, you see it here, he wrote an article in which he went through the Yerushalmi and Kodshim and absolutely endorsed it, as did, of course, of Shlomo Buber and various others. Now, many people have written articles on this episode, and I'm not the first person to talk about it, but what I'm going to do today perhaps is a little bit more original. Before we talk about what I want to show you, which is very, very unique and which no one has ever seen before, I want to show you this Tzad Romeo, which was published in 1913 by somebody called Janowski. And Janowski, Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Janowski, is from Kiev. He was a fascinating individual, and he basically tore Friedlander to pieces and proved that he was utterly wrong. Friedlander tried to attack him, but by that time there were so many articles published in Tel Talpios. We have here a macho, a protest that was published against Friedlander, against Tel Talpios, so this one is against Hamodia by Friedlander. I have here a poster that was published against Tel Talpios by Friedlander. He was a prolific publisher, but Tel Talpios and Israelit and various other publications and journals that were coming out at the time refused to accept that this was an authentic Talmud Yerushalmi on Kodshim, and they totally rubbished it, and it became something that was not taken seriously. No one bought it, and frankly, even though he lived on for quite a number of years afterwards, some 15 years afterwards, he sank without trace and disappeared, and no one ever heard of him again. The reason why I want to talk about this today, by the way, this was a very, very long introduction. The Yerushalmi and Kodshim is definitely a topic that I love talking about, but I'm very lucky that the person who wrote this article, if you look at the article, which is here, which is from the Encyclopedia Judaica, you see here that every article in Encyclopedia Judaica, if it's not a generic article that was just written by the editorial team, it has initials afterwards that tell you who the person was that wrote it. After this article, if you can see here, it says A.SCH. So I checked it out, and the person who wrote the article on Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander was none other than a neighbour of mine from London. I lived on Hodford Road, and he lived on the Ridgeway. His name was Adi Shisha, Avraham Shisha, and he was originally from Vienna, a descendant of the Chasam Sofer, and somebody who had a deep and keen interest in Jewish history, and one of the most prolific libraries of books and manuscripts I have ever encountered in my life. His entire house was books. You walked in and there was books going all the way up the stairs, and books in every room, and books on every table, and books next to every sofa. It was a house of books. There were no bricks, there were books. Everything was books. He had the most extensive collection you can imagine. Well, about 12, 14 years ago, whenever it was, before I moved to the United States, he died, and there were people who were dealing with his estate, and I asked them if I could obtain information about the Yerushalmi. So they gave me, they sold it to me. These are his files of all the information that he put together on the Yerushalmi of Kodshim, on Kodshim, that was put together by Friedlander. These are the files. So if you talk about Rabbi Greenwald's files, these are my files that I obtained from the Shisha collection after he passed away. It's been lying in my, by the way, there's no way I can cover all the material here, but this file contains much, much more than anything he wrote in the Encyclopedia Judaica or anything that has been published. But the key thing is this, that I obtained a copy of the forged Yerushalmi on Kodshim. This is the Shisha collection forged Yerushalmi on Kodshim. And I have to tell you, it does come up on auction. It usually sells somewhere between $500 and $1,000. So it's not unusual because it's a very rare piece. Most of them were destroyed. I don't know if they were put in Shemus or just thrown away in the trash. Who would want to have a forged Yerushalmi in their library? So there's probably a couple of hundred left in the world, maybe even less, maybe less than 100. They do come up on auction from time to time, but this one is unique. You see, this one was Friedlander's own copy. I don't know how Shisha got it. In fact, I do know how Shisha got it, because there was a man in England, and I'm going to again digress for a minute. literally for a couple of minutes, because he put together, before I even open the Yerushalmi, he put together a very interesting collection. He actually, I don't know if he typed it out himself, of correspondence that was found in the pages of a journal, a newspaper in England called HaYehudi. I've highlighted, I actually went through them. He just put it together, he typed it out, but I've got copies of the HaYehudi. HaYehudi was published by a man called Suwalski, Yitzchok Suwalski. Yitzchok Suwalski is not a well-known individual. Yitzchok Suwalski was a Litvak, who was a bit of a maskil, but very frum, and he published quite prolifically. He was a very good writer, had a beautiful pen, a beautiful Hebrew. And he published, and he came to London in 1897, and between 1897 and 1913, he published on a weekly basis, which must have taken enormous energy, published on a weekly basis this newspaper, HaYehudi, which contained news from across the Jewish world, and he wrote it, he edited it, he published it, he typeset it, he did everything. He was absolute one-man show. And in 1908, from January through to March, April, almost every week there was correspondence in HaYehudi with regard to this forged Yerushalmi, including letters from Friedlander, including letters from various others, and he published them. And there was one person who lived in a place called Southport, it's near Manchester, north of England, who was a vigorous and energetic defender of Friedlander. And his name was Jacob Gordon. Now what's interesting is that the copy of the Yerushalmi that I have, which comes from the Shisha collection, is actually dedicated to this Jacob Gordon. And as it turns out, and here you see the Hakdosha, not sure you can see it there, but I know that Carly will make sure to have it up when we have the video up on YouTube. That's the Hakdosha. In the Hakdosha he says, Hey Yerushalmi Hazeh, Hu Kinyan Kaspo Shel Hagon Hagvir Reb Yaakov Gordon, Mi Southport, Va'ato Be'ir Bournemouth, England, and it's signed by the author. And this was the original. Now, what's nice about this one is always when these copies emerge, they're published on terribly brittle, acidic paper. So if you ever buy a copy of the forged Yerushalmi, I told you the price should be somewhere between $500 and $1,000, you're going to see that the paper is very brittle. This is published on something which is called, if you know anything about book buying, and particularly Jewish book buying, it's called regal paper. It's a much thicker, much better quality paper. And this regal paper is much more hardy, doesn't tear easily. Here is the so-called Ksav Yad. Can you see it there? It's dark. I know that Carly has made a very good scan of it. This is the original, as it were, Ksav Yad. It's fake. But he put this together, and this must have been exceptionally expensive for him to do. And he wanted to prove this is the second volume. I know it comes first in this bound edition. This is the second volume of the Yerushalmi that he published in 1909. And this is the title page. The title page of Zvochim, and it's with the, if you can see it here, it's with the Perish, with the commentary of the Cheshek Shlomo, which was Friedlander's own Perish. And what's fascinating is that he writes here that this is Lezichron Olam. Can you see it here? Lezichron Olam. For the benefactor who enabled the publication of this volume, David Gordon. I just told you his name was Yaakov Gordon, right? So David Gordon was the publisher of, apparently the sponsor. He was the person who enabled the publication of the fake Yerushalmi, which of course explains why he was so vigorously defending the Yerushalmi publication in the pages of HaYehudi, of the newspaper published by Suwalski. But David Gordon wasn't actually his name. And we have a letter here. And the letter came in these files that I got from the Shisha collection. And it says as follows, it's a letter to Yaakov Gordon. And it says, Hayisi b'yom echad b'September v'reinu harav Rabbi Klein. I saw Rabbi Klein, and he showed me something. Ki toos nafal, ki nitfas David Gordon. And there's a mistake because it says that David Gordon is the sponsor of this publication. Ube'emes shmoi Kodshai hu Yaakov, and in fact your name is Yaakov. So I put the name David in there by mistake. V'rak alidei machlosi u'melachti na'aseh alidei acherim niyasa zois. And it's only because of the fact that I was sick and this was done by other people. He's coming up with all kinds of excuses. Can you imagine that? This guy gave him a fortune of money to publish this book, to enable its publication, and he couldn't even get his name right. So he gave him an excuse. But I didn't have the original letter. I'm going to get to that in a minute. Because before we're going to get to that, we have one last thing to tell you. And that is that Shisha noted that Yaakov Gordon, who was his great defender, wrote a bunch of notes on the Yerushalmi, on the volumes that he received. And it became evident, as you look through the notes, it became evident to... Do we have scans of these notes, Carly? We have scans, right? If you can see, I don't know how you can highlight the notes. You can see there's a note over there that's written, it's signed Yaakov Gordon. Yaakov Gordon, in fact, was a massive Talmud Chacham. He inherited a lot of money. He never was a rabbi of a shul. That means he did have his own base medrash in Bournemouth. He lived not far from Boscombe, which of course I'm familiar with because we used to go on vacation to Bournemouth when I was a child, and even when we had children, we went there. He lived about a mile from the shul in Wootton Gardens. That where he lived no longer exists because they built a highway over there. But he had a shul in his house. He was a fantastic Talmud Chacham. And he was, I know that other people have taken this title. He was a Shoel Hador. He corresponded with every single one of the great rabbis of his day and wrote articles in all the journals. And he kept a huge file of his tshuvas. I know that they sold recently on auction hundreds of letters that he received from rabbis, and a file of all the letters. He kept a record of all the letters that he wrote to many rabbis across Europe. He was a fantastic Talmud Chacham. Here we have another extended note. Can you see this here on the side? An extended note from Yaakov Gordon on the Yerushalmi. Let me read to you what Shisha says with regard to those notes. He says, Nira shegam hu yoda shehu ziyuf. He said, you can, by the way, put this up, Carly, this note can go up. He realized over time, as he was going through the Yerushalmi, he realized that this book that he had sponsored was in fact a forgery, and that Friedlander had fooled him, and he may have been very charismatic and very convincing, and the Yerushalmi may have looked fantastic, but in the end, it was a forgery, and even its greatest sponsor and defender, Yaakov Gordon of Southport and Bournemouth, realized that it was a forgery and that Friedlander was a fraud. Now, what's wonderful is, and this is I'm kind of bringing this all to us, this circle to a close. This letter was in the files that I bought alongside this Gemara when I bought it. But last year there was an auction, London Treasures, and London Treasures. Oh, I've dropped the scissors. Sorry about that. Just give me the scissors, thank you so much. So last year, I have not opened this yet. This was an auction on October 26th, 2020. And apparently in this envelope is the letter which Rabbi Friedlander, this Dr. Shlomo Friedlander, by the way, he was no more or less a doctor than you or me, that he writes to him, that he writes to Gordon an apology because he realizes he's messed up, because he's misspelt his name. In fact, he's given him the wrong name. He's called him David instead of calling him Yaakov. So I'm going to open this up right now. We're going to see if that letter's inside here. I've not opened this since I've received it. I got it last October, but this is the first time I'm opening it, so let's see what the letter says. Let's have a look. Here we go. So this, to come back full circle to the beginning when I showed you that piece that I bought many, many years ago and gathered dust on my shelf. This is the style of writing of this fraudulent conman, this Friedlander, that he would write in this Rashi script. So it would appear as if he was a Sephardi. He wasn't a Sephardi at all. He was from Belarus and he spoke a fluent Litvish Yiddish, and he pretended to be a Sephardi so that people should be convinced about the Yerushalmi. But here he writes, let's have a look if we can find this particular letter in which he admits that he's made a mistake about the name. Here we go. Here it is. I've not seen this. It's the first time I'm looking at it. Here we go. Here's the letter. This is the letter that was sent to Yaakov Gordon, his sponsor, in which he says, I was in Satmar, Varini Harav Rita Klein. Rita Klein showed me, Ki to'us nofal, ki nidfas David Gordon. He says, and Shmoy Kodshim hu Yaakov. There you go, there's the letter. So with that, we'll draw to a close. That's the episode, the saga of the forged Yerushalmi, and that brings episode 1 of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library to an end. I'm very grateful to you for watching, and hopefully you'll watch me for the next episode, and thank you.